I was reading about this guy, Walter Benjamin. He was a brilliant Jewish philosopher living in Germany, the kind of person who spent his days debating the deepest questions of justice and power with the greatest minds of his time. But by 1940, none of those intellectual connections mattered. He was a man on the run, desperately trying to cross the border to escape the advancing Nazi regime. What's haunting is that Benjamin spent his life obsessed with a specific paradox, one that eventually caught up with him at that border. He looked at the world and saw something most of us try to ignore, that the law, the very thing we rely on to protect us from violence, is actually built on a foundation of it. We're told that the state uses force only to keep us safe, to stop the bad guys. But Benjamin noticed that the state doesn't actually hate violence. It just hates it when you use it. It claims a monopoly. It says it's okay for us to hit you, but it's never okay for you to hit back. He called this the spectral mixture. He pointed to the police not just as people who catch criminals, but as a force that operates in a gray zone. When a cop decides how to handle a situation where the law isn't clear, they aren't just enforcing the law. In that moment, they are creating it. Benjamin realized that every legal system begins with an act of violence, a revolution, a conquest, a war, and then spends the rest of its existence using more violence to make sure you forget where it came from. He saw the law not as a shield, but as a cycle. And as he stood at the edge of Europe watching the ultimate legal violence of the Third Reich swallow everything he knew, he realized the most terrifying truth of all. The system isn't broken when it uses violence. That's exactly how it's designed to work.
It creates a sense of vertigo, doesn't it? I mean, it's just this complete inversion of everything we're taught.
We spend our entire lives operating under this assumption that law is the opposite of violence.
Yeah. We think of civilization as this process of, getting rid of violence, pushing it out to the margins.
But Benjamin just flips the whole table. He's saying that civilization isn't about eliminating violence at all.
No, it's just about managing it. It's about administration, taking this raw, chaotic force and, putting it into a bureaucratic system.
It is vertigo-inducing, and honestly, it feels a bit like a conspiracy theory when you first hear it. It's easy to say the system is violent when you're looking at something as extreme as the Third Reich. That's an easy target.
Of course.
But Benjamin, he seems to be arguing that this applies to all states, even the ones we live in, the liberal democracies. He's not just talking about fascists, he's talking about the DNA of legal order itself.
And that is the absolute critical distinction to make. You have to remember, he wrote his critique of violence in 1921.
Right, way before the Nazis were in full.
This was the Weimar Republic. It wasn't the height of totalitarianism, not yet. He was looking at the fundamental machinery, the engine of how any state establishes its authority. And his conclusion is that the state and violence are twins. They aren't enemies. One gives birth to the other. You can't have one without the other.
So if they are twins, we need to understand the family resemblance. And we have a lot to get through today because we're not just going to stay in 1920s Germany. We're going to trace this spectral mixture he talks about into some really unexpected places.
Like university admissions offices.
University admissions offices, yeah. And suburban living rooms. And then eventually into the middle of a riot. But before we get there, I really need to get my head around this core theory, this idea that the state doesn't really care about justice and only cares about the monopoly.
Well, let's be careful with the word justice. The state cares very, very much about legal justice.
Okay.
Which is a very specific thing. But to understand it, Benjamin draws this really important line between two ways of looking at the world, natural law and positive law. And the friction between these two, right? It explains everything about why the state acts the way it does.
Okay, let's start with natural law. I've always understood that as a kind of moral baseline, don't kill, don't steal, the things that are supposedly true, whether a government exists or not.
And in the context of violence, natural law sees violence as a raw tool. It's just a means to an end. And the justification for that violence comes entirely from the end goal.
So if the goal is good, the violence is okay.
If the goal is considered just, then the violence used to get there is justified. The means don't matter as much as the ends.
Yeah.
Let's say you're walking home. Someone attacks you in an alley. You fight back to protect yourself. Under a pure natural law framework, your violence is justified. Why? Because your goal preserving your own life is seen as inherently just.
Right. Self-defense.
Or, think bigger. A population rises up to overthrow a tyrant who is starving them, hoarding all the food. Natural law would say that revolutionary violence is righteous because the goal, liberty, survival, is righteous.
I think most people operate on that kind of logic intuitively. If the end is good, the means are permissible within reason.
But the modern state absolutely cannot function on that logic. It would be chaos for the state. The modern state operates on positive law.
And positive law is different, how?
Positive law doesn't look at the end. It doesn't care why you use violence. It doesn't care if your goal was noble. It only cares about one thing, the means. It cares about authorization.
So in the positive law framework, if I fight off that attacker in the alley, the state doesn't give me a high five for surviving. It pulls out a rule book.
It pulls out the rule book. It checks if there's a statute, a pre-written law, that permits you to use force in that specific way, in those specific circumstances. If you use violence that hasn't been pre-approved by the state, I mean, even if your cause is the noblest in the world, even if you are literally Robin Hood stealing from the rich to feed the starving, the state condemns you.
But why? I don't get that. If the result is justice, why does the state care so much about the process?
Because of the monopoly. This is where we have to bring in Max Weber. He had that famous definition of the state.
The entity that has the monopoly on legitimate violence?
The entity that successfully claims the monopoly on the legitimate use of physical force. If the state allows you, or anyone, to decide for yourself when violence is justified based on your own personal natural law calculation, then the state is no longer the sovereign. You've set up a competing legal system, and the state cannot tolerate competition.
So it's a turf war.
It is the ultimate turf war. We can use that jealous parent analogy from the outline. It's a really good one. Imagine a father who hits his child for misbehaving. But then one day, that child hits his younger sibling. The father gets furious and punishes the child for hitting.
Right.
Now, does the father punish the child because he believes hitting is universally immoral?
Because the father hits, he's a hypocrite.
Exactly. The father punishes the child because the child has usurped a privilege that belongs solely to the father. The message isn't violence is bad. The message is, I am the only one allowed to be violent in this house.
And the state is that father.
The state is that father. When a worker goes on a strike that turns violent, or a citizen takes revenge on a thief who the police didn't catch, the state steps in to crush it. Not necessarily because the strike is wrong, or the thief didn't deserve it, but because the actors bypassed the state's official channels.
They challenged the monopoly.
They committed the ultimate sin. They acted as if they, too, had the right to decide when force was legitimate.
That puts the police in a very, very weird light. We usually think of them as public servants who enforce the rules that are already on the books. But if we follow this logic, they're not just rule enforcers. They're basically the perimeter guards for this monopoly.
They're so much more than guards. And this is where Benjamin gets really deep and, frankly, a bit disturbing. He talks about the police as this spectral or ghostly presence.
Spectral is such a strange word for a cop in riot gear. It sounds mystical, or something out of a horror movie.
He uses it to describe the fact that the police exist in a state of indeterminacy. They operate in a fog. In a democracy, we're taught there's this clean separation of powers.
Right. The legislature makes the law, the courts interpret the law, and the police enforce the law. It's supposed to be a neat, clean chain of command. It's not just messy. Benjamin argues that the separation is a complete lie. Think about a protest that's getting heated, or even a chaotic traffic stop at 2 a.m. The law, the text on the page, cannot possibly account for every single variable of human behavior in real time.
Right. The law is abstract, the street is concrete.
It's totally fluid. So when a police officer decides to swing a baton, or to deploy tear gas, or to arrest someone for a vague charge like disorderly conduct, they are making a split-second decision where the law is silent or ambiguous.
They're improvising.
They are improvising, but they're improvising with the full authority of the state behind them. In that moment, they are not just enforcing a law that already exists, they're deciding what the law is for that situation. They are, in effect, legislating with their weapons.
Wow.
And Benjamin says this collapses the whole distinction between law-making violence, which is usually the big dramatic stuff of revolutions and wars, and law-preserving violence, which is the boring day-to-day stuff of courts and prisons.
The police do both at the same time?
Both. This time. They are the point where the state's potential for violence becomes formless, adaptable, and everywhere. That's the ghost, the specter.
So every time a cop makes a judgment call on a chaotic street corner, they're essentially writing a new temporary bylaw for that specific square footage of pavement.
And that is why the state protects them so fiercely. They aren't just employees. They represent the state's fundamental ability to manifest its power anywhere, anytime, without needing to wait for a judge or a senator. They are the monopoly in motion.
Okay, that's a heavy theoretical framework. The state claims a monopoly, it hates competition, and it uses the police to constantly recreate its authority on the fly.
Right. But most of us, most of our listeners aren't dealing with riot police every day. They're dealing with other kinds of institutions, bureaucracies. And this is where I want to pivot to our first story. Yeah. Because we have this narrative about a guy, let's call him Julian.
And this is where we see the shift from physical, overt violence to something more subtle. Administrative violence.
Exactly. So, Julian, he's a senior admissions officer at a very prestigious, an Ivy League level university on the East Coast. He's been in the job for 30 years. And he's a true believer. He believes in what he calls the sanctity of the score.
Okay.
For him, the admissions process was this beautiful machine for meritocracy. You put in the grades, you put in the test scores, the extracurriculars, and the machine objectively spits out the best and the brightest. It was fair, it was blind. In Benjamin's terms, it was law-preserving.
It was a stable legal order. The rules were known. There was a contract. If you follow these rules, the system rewards you.
But then the meeting happens. Julian describes sitting around this massive mahogany table, the kind that he says costs more than a car, and he just watched that contract get set on fire. The university leadership had decided that the old law, merit scores, that whole system, wasn't producing the social outcome they wanted.
They had a new vision for the student body.
A completely new vision. They wanted a different demographic mix, a different ideological profile for the incoming class. So they introduced all these new, incredibly vague criteria. Things like personality scores, lived experience metrics, stuff you can't measure.
And this right here is a classic example of what Benjamin would call lawmaking violence.
Calling it violence feels like a stretch, doesn't it? I mean, nobody's getting physically hit. It's an administrative decision. A kid just gets a rejection letter in the mail. Where's the violence?
The violence doesn't have to be physical to be structural or to be devastating. Think about what's happening here. The institution is tearing up the established rights of the applicants who played by the old rules for their entire lives.
Okay.
Julian talked about watching a specific file for a brilliant student, top 1% on every metric, perfect record, concert violinist, the whole package gets tossed aside. Not because the student failed by any existing standard, but because the student didn't fit the new vision the university was trying to construct.
So the violence is the betrayal of that promise, the betrayal of the contract.
The violence is the imposition of a new arbitrary order. Lawmaking violence is always revolutionary in its own way. It sweeps away the old rights to establish new ones. When a military coup happens, a general gets on TV and says the Constitution is suspended.
Right.
When an admissions office does this, they are effectively saying the old Constitution of merit is suspended. For that student who spent 18 years of their life meticulously preparing under the old laws, that is a profoundly violent act. It renders their labor, their identity, and all their expectations totally null and void.
And Julian felt that. He described it as a feeling of, physical nausea. He said he realized he wasn't a judge of talent anymore. He was a social engineer. He was just moving pieces around on a board to create a specific image for the university's marketing brochure.
And that top-down decision, that act of lawmaking, it doesn't just stay in the boardroom. It trickles down. This is what connects that university to every stressed-out family in the suburbs. Because if the law of the university changes, the behavior of the subjects the families trying to get their kids in must change to survive.
Which brings us to this idea of concerted cultivation. We looked at the data on this, and it's really disturbing. It's the sociological term for that intense, high-pressure parenting style that's become so common in the upper middle class.
Yes, that's Annette LaRoe's work. She contrasts it with the accomplishment of natural growth, which she found was more common in working-class families. You let kids play, you let them settle their own fights, you give them autonomy, and just let them be kids.
But concerted cultivation is the opposite of that. It views the child as a project, a resume that's constantly in progress from the age of 3.
It's the complete industrialization of childhood.
The Reddit threads we pulled for this were just heartbreaking. You have parents describing their lives as logistics managers. One comment stuck with me. I'm not a mom, I'm a dispatcher. Just driving from fencing to Mandarin class, then to coding camp, then to volunteer at the soup kitchen for the essay.
But you have to look at why they're doing it. They aren't doing it because they're tyrants who hate their kids' freedom. They're doing it because they are terrified of the law. They know that the university, the gatekeeper, now demands a very specific type of subject, so they feel they have no choice but to violently mold their children to fit that shape.
You're using that word violently again. Violently.
Look at the psychological toll this takes. We found that study comparing Yale students, the absolute winners of this concerted cultivation game, to students at Cleveland State. And the Yale students were, on average, marginally more proficient at certain cognitive tasks, about 1.9% better.
Wait, 1.9%? That is the entire return on investment for 18 years of no sleep, no free time, and constant pressure.
That's the measured cognitive gain. Worse, the same study found that the Yale students were statistically more likely to be jerks.
That's the scientific term, I assume?
They scored lower on agreeableness, were less likely to help a stranger in a controlled experiment, and were more prone to interpersonal conflict.
So the system, this whole brutal machine of concerted cultivation, is actually selecting for what? A kind of high-functioning sociopathy.
It's selecting for ruthlessness. It's selecting for people who view life as a zero-sum competition, who see other people not as neighbors to live with, but as obstacles to be overcome on the way to the top. The violence of the arbitrary lawmaking admissions process creates a violent subject.
And that's the institutional betrayal Julian was talking about. The system claims to be building leaders for a better society, but it's actually just building these efficient, unhappy combatants.
And breaking families in the process.
That 1.9% statistic is it's going to stick with me. We are tearing families apart at the seams to get a margin of error improvement in cognitive efficiency.
And that leads us directly to the next level of state control. Because if the university as an institution has started treating the child as a set of metrics to be optimized, the state has started treating the family itself as a set of biological risks to be managed.
This is the story of Clara. And this one, I'll be honest, this one scared me more than the admissions stuff, because admissions is optional in a way. You can choose not to play the Harvard game. You cannot choose not to deal with the state.
Clara's story is the perfect illustration of the shift from what people used to call the nanny state to something new, the therapeutic state. And it is absolutely vital that we understand the difference, because people use those terms interchangeably, and they are not the same thing at all.
The nanny state is what we complain about when the mayor tries to ban large sodas.
Right. It's wear your seatbelt, don't smoke in the park, eat your vegetables.
It's annoying, it's paternalistic, it treats you like a dumb kid who doesn't know what's good for you, but it's still about your actions.
Correct. The nanny state is fundamentally about rules and behaviors. It's external. A therapeutic state is internal. It's not satisfied with controlling your behavior. It wants to cure your personality. It wants to manage your thoughts and feelings.
So tell us about Clara. She's living in a suburb in a northern European country. She's a single mom, teenager, and he's going through a rough phase. He's angry. He's skipping school sometimes. He's shouting at her. Just normal, messy, awful teenage stuff.
In 1990, what happens? Maybe the neighbors complain about the noise. Maybe the cops come by once and say, hey, keep it down.
But in the therapeutic state, it's not the police who come to the door, it's the social workers. And they don't bring a citation or a warning. They bring a clipboard and a psychological evaluation form.
Clara described it as an invasion of benevolence. That phrase is so chilling.
They didn't accuse her of a crime. They didn't say she was a bad person. They said they were there to help. They evaluated her parenting style. They looked at the cleanliness of her house. They analyzed her emotional interactions with Leo, judging whether they were optimal.
And this is a perfect street-level example of Foucault's concept of biopolitics.
Hey, broke down biopolitics for me. I always get lost in the academic jargon on this one.
Okay. The old form of power, sovereign power, the power of a king, was like a lumberjack. If you broke the law, the king chopped you down. He had the power of death. It was reactive and spectacular.
The guillotine, the hanging.
Biopolitics, the new form of power, is like a gardener. The gardener doesn't just wait for a tree to get sick and then chop it down. The gardener is proactive. The gardener prunes, fertilizes weeds, shapes the growth. The gardener is responsible for the overall health of the garden.
So the state isn't just governing us anymore, it's gardening us.
It's gardening the population.
Exactly. The state now views the population as a single biological mass that needs to be kept healthy, productive, and efficient. So if Clara's son, Leo, is acting out, he isn't just a bad kid making bad choices. In this new framework, he is a defective component in the social body. He is a future risk to be managed.
And Clara, by failing to control him, is.
She is a failed service provider.
That's the phrase from her story that chilled me to the bone. Service provider. Mothers aren't mothers with natural rights and instincts anymore. They are contracted agents of the state's child-rearing department.
And when the state views you as a service provider, what can it do? It can fire you. In Claire's case, after months of evaluations and support plans, they removed Leo from her care. No physical illness, no starvation, nothing that would have met the old legal standard. He was removed because the therapeutic assessment determined that her home was not optimizing his future well-being. This is the core of administrative violence. It's colder and, in a way, more terrifying than police violence because you can't fight it. If a cop hits you with a baton, you can sue. You can scream police brutality. But if a social worker in a nice sweater says, "We're doing this for the child's own good," how do you possibly argue with that? You look like a monster if you disagree.
That's the trap. It's what the psychiatrist Thomas Saz warned about decades ago. When the state takes on the role of a doctor, the citizen becomes a patient. And patients don't have rights in the same way citizens do. They have treatment plans.
And you can't claim your constitutional right to refuse help when the state has defined that help as mandatory for the sake of public health.
It medicalizes every form of social deviance. Disapproved behaviors, whether it's smoking or obesity or a messy house or a non-standard parenting style, they get relabeled. They're not sins or crimes anymore. They're illnesses or risk factors that the state has a duty to treat.
And what's so infuriating about Claire's story is the hypocrisy of it all. As this was happening to her, her family being audited to death and ultimately dissolved over a messy bedroom and some teenage shouting matches. 2 blocks away, there was an open-air drug market and cars were being stolen every night. And nobody was doing a thing about it.
And that is the concept of anarcho-tyranny in a nutshell.
That's Samuel Francis's term, right? Yeah.
It describes a state that is, on the one hand, terrified of and incapable of dealing with actual criminals, but on the other hand, exquisitely tyrannical toward law-abiding ordinary citizens.
But what if shouldn't the state go after the actual bad guys?
Because going after real criminals is hard.
Yeah.
It's dangerous. They are violent. They don't have registered addresses. They don't fill out paperwork. They don't cooperate. But Clara is what political scientists call legible.
Legible.
The state can read her. She's in the system. She has a tax record, a social security number, a bank account. She answers the door when the authorities knock. She's an easy target.
So it's just bureaucratic laziness.
It's worse than laziness. It's about efficiency. The modern managerial state needs to show metrics of activity. It needs to justify its budget. It is infinitely easier and safer for a state agency to generate a 50-page report on Clara's parenting deficits and intervene in her life than it is to actually solve a violent gang war. So the state tyrannizes the innocent because they are easy to process, and it tolerates the anarchy of the criminal because it's too costly and dangerous to stop.
It's the path of least resistance. You audit the taxpayer who made a small mistake. You ignore the major tax evader.
You give a parking ticket to the soccer mom. You let the drug dealer's car stay double parked. And that creates a very specific, very deep type of rage in people like Clara. The feeling that the law is not a shield for her at all, but a weapon that is only ever pointed at her.
Which brings us to the breaking point, because eventually people get tired of the anarcho-tyranny, they get tired of the lawmaking violence of the bureaucracy that Julian saw, and they start to think, you know what, maybe we'd be better off without the state at all. Maybe we should just burn the whole thing down.
And that is a very romantic and a very dangerous fantasy. And this leads us to our third story, the story of Elias.
Elias is a bookstore owner. He's an intellectual. He's exactly the kind of guy who would have read Walter Benjamin in his 20s and loved it. For most of his life, he hated the police. He thought the state's monopoly on violence was inherently evil and oppressive. He dreamed of the state crumbling so that a more organic, humane, grassroots community could rise up in its place.
A very common notion on certain parts of the political spectrum.
Very romantic notion, yeah. Until the riots started. Elias lived in a city that underwent a period of severe civil unrest. For weeks, the police effectively withdrew from his neighborhood, the state. It just vanished. The monopoly was broken.
So he got his wish. Did he see a beautiful, organic community of mutual aid bloom in the absence of state power?
He saw hell. He saw what sociologists call anomie.
A lack of law.
He watched from his apartment window above his store as his bookstore, his entire life's work, was looted and then set on fire. And not by starving people looking for bread, but by people who were just enjoying the sheer act of destruction. He saw violence that wasn't spectral or administrative. It was chaotic, and it was totally, terrifyingly unpredictable.
This is the Hobbesian nightmare come to life. Thomas Hobbes wrote his great work Leviathan in the aftermath of the bloody English Civil War. He looked at that chaos and said that in the state of nature, without a powerful sovereign, life is nasty, brutish, and short.
And Elias had this moment of tragic reconciliation. He told us he found himself a lifelong atheist and cop hater, literally praying for the sound of sirens. He realized that as much as he hated the stationary bandit of the state, the roving bandits of the mob were infinitely worse.
Let's unpack that stationary bandit concept. It's from the economist Mancur Olson, and it explains exactly why Elias felt that way.
Okay, so the theory is that a government is basically just a bandit gang that decided to settle down and get organized.
Yes. Imagine a village in a lawless land. If you have roving bandits, they ride into town, they kill people, they steal all the food and valuables, they burn the houses down, and then they leave. If you are a villager in that world, what incentive do you have to be productive?
Zero. Why would I plant a crop if I know it's just going to be stolen and I'll be killed?
You live hand to mouth. Civilization creates nothing. It's a permanent state of poverty and fear. But then one day, a particularly smart bandit leader has an idea. He says, instead of raiding this village and leaving, I'm going to conquer it and stay here. I'll build a wall. I will use my gang's violence to kill any other roving bandits who try to come in.
He's offering protection.
He is offering protection, but it's purely for his own selfish benefit. He goes to the villagers and says, from now on, I will take 30% of your crops every year as tax. I won't take 100% because I'm not stupid. I want you to survive so you can plant again next year so I can tax you again. This is the stationary bandit. It's a kind of parasitic but symbiotic relationship. He needs you to be prosperous so he can be rich.
So the state is just a mafia that learned to think long-term.
Political economy would argue yes, that's the origin. But for the villager, for Elias hiding in his apartment, the stationary bandit is infinitely preferable to the roving bandit. Why? Because the stationary bandit provides one crucial thing: predictability.
You know the rules.
You know the rules. The rule is pay your 30%, don't cause trouble for me, and you get to live and work in peace. That's a deal most people will take.
And that's what Elias realized. The state's violence, the police, the courts, the laws, it's predictable violence. You can plan a life around it. The mob's violence is random, arbitrary, and total. And human beings, human civilization, cannot survive in a state of randomness.
It's the tragedy of his reconciliation. He came to understand that the very monopoly on violence he had spent his life despising was the only thing standing between his bookstore and the fire. He had to accept the thing he hated, because the only alternative was the void of enemy.
But wait, didn't Benjamin offer a way out of this trap? He wasn't just saying submit to the stationary bandit or face chaos. He talked about something else, the general strike, and he called it divine violence.
And this is by far the most abstract and difficult part of his theory, but it's also maybe the most important. To understand it, you have to see how Benjamin distinguished between mythic violence, which is all the lawmaking, blood-spilling, border-creating violence of the state, and this other thing, this divine violence.
Now, divine sounds religious, but he didn't mean God coming down from the heavens and smiting people, right?
No, not literally. He meant divine in the sense of something that is pure, sovereign, and stands completely outside the existing legal system. His primary example was the proletarian general strike, an idea he borrowed from the theorist Georges Sorel.
But how is a strike violence? It's the most passive act imaginable. It's literally just doing nothing. It's staying home.
To the state, doing nothing on a mass scale is an act of extreme violence. The state is not a thing, it's a set of relationships. It relies on its connections to function. It needs the trains to run, the factories to hum, the electricity to flow, the taxes to be collected. If the entire population simply stops, if they withdraw their participation,
you suffocate the state. You cut the cord of power.
Benjamin called this divine because it is, in his words, lethal without spilling blood. It destroys the legal status of the oppressor without necessarily killing the individuals who make up the state. If a revolution happens and the rebels storm the palace and behead the king, that's mythic violence. You've just replaced one head with another. You've made a new law.
It's Animal Farm. The pigs just become the new farmers.
Exactly. The cycle continues. But if the people simply withdraw their consent, if they strike and make the system inoperable, the state dissolves into nothing. It doesn't create a new law. It simply abolishes the power of the old law. For Benjamin, it's a pure destructive act that clears the slate.
But Benjamin was a deep pessimist, wasn't he? He didn't seem to think we could just stay in that divine state of pure potential forever.
No. He saw the trap. He saw the cycle. Even if you could somehow pull off this perfect, bloodless divine violence, even if you have the perfect revolution that dissolves the old state, what happens the next day? Eventually you have to organize society again. You have to figure out how to get the trash collected. You have to build a new institution. And the moment you build that new institution,
You start making new laws. You create a new police force to enforce them. You create new university admissions criteria. You hire new social workers to check on families.
and the whole cycle of violence, of lawmaking and law preserving, begins all over again. We seem to be trapped between the suffocating, predictable order of the State Cler's world, Julian's world, and the terrifying, unpredictable chaos of Enemy Elias's world during the riots.
It really feels like there's no exit door in this room.
Benjamin would probably say that the first step to finding an exit is to stop lying to ourselves about the nature of the room we're in. We have to stop pretending that the law is this neutral, benevolent force that exists to protect us. We have to learn to see the violence embedded in the very architecture of our society.
And we've covered a huge amount of ground here today trying to do that. We started with Walter Benjamin, a refugee on the border of Spain. We went into the mahogany boardrooms of the Ivy League. We went into the living room of a monitored mom in suburbia, and we ended up in a burning bookstore in a city without laws.
And the thread connecting all of them is that core concept of the spectral mixture. The chilling realization that violence isn't an event that happens to the system when it fails. Violence is the fuel of the system. It's what makes it run.
So Julian's admissions office wasn't broken when it arbitrarily changed its rules. It was performing its function of lawmaking. Clara's social worker wasn't a glitch in the system. She was the system, functioning exactly as designed.
They were the visible, everyday manifestations of the state's monopoly on defining reality, a monopoly it ultimately backs up with force.
It really forces you to reevaluate how we ask for change, doesn't it? Because usually when we see a problem in the world like, say, inequality in schools or troubled teens or anything, our first instinct is to say, there ought to be a law.
The government should do something about that.
Right. But if Benjamin is right, every single time we say the government should do something, we are actually asking the monopoly to expand its reach. We are inviting more of this structural administrative violence into the equation.
We're handing the stationary bandit a new weapon, a new tool of control, and just hoping he points it at the people we don't like. But as Clara found out, and as the student Julian's story found out, eventually that weapon gets pointed at you.
And that is the provocative thought I think we should leave everyone with. Most of us believe that if we just make better laws, or elect better people, or design better admissions criteria, we can somehow eliminate the violence of the system. We think we can wash it clean. But Benjamin suggests that the system is violence. The law doesn't protect you from the fire. The law is the fire, just managed and directed. And so the real question isn't how to escape it, but to recognize that every time we ask the state to fix a problem for us, whether it's unfairness in schools or trouble in the home, we are strengthening the very hand that might one day close around us.
But once you see it that way, you can't unsee it. You start to see the police power and all the paperwork.
And maybe that's the first step to some kind of actual freedom, seeing the invisible. Thanks for going on this dive with me. It was a heavy one, but I think the necessary one.
Always a pleasure to explore the darkness.
We'll catch you on the next deep dive.